Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, the UK Energy Sector EDI Interventions Scoping Study Survey. So my name is Claire Scott. I'm the Ignite Programme Manager, and I'm delighted to host the session today. For anyone new to Ignite, we are a 4-year EPSRC funded Network Plus established in September 2022. The network is led by the University of Strathclyde in partnership with Imperial College London, the Universities of Manchester, Nottingham, Bristol and Brunel. So our core mission is to create a more diverse, inclusive and equitable energy research sector to improve innovation and support the UK's transition to net zero by 2050. I'll add a link to the website into the chat in a few minutes. So I'd just like to say thank you everyone for joining us today. We know how busy everyone is and we really appreciate your interest in this important piece of work. Today we're joined by Professor Mustafa Özbilgin from the Brunel University London. He's the Ignite co-investigator and a lead on the report. He's an internationally recognised scholar in equality, diversity and inclusion with an extensive experience advising organisations and sectors on how to build more inclusive and equitable systems. And we're very pleased to have him with us today. So we will, I'll give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover in an hour. So Professor Özbilgin will walk us through the report and its findings, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. If you want to add the questions into the chat at any point during the presentation, and we'll gather them and address as many as we can during the Q&A. Just a quick reminder that the session follows the Ignite Network Code of Conduct, and we ask everyone to contribute respectfully, can't say that, keep discussions constructive and help us maintain a welcoming, inclusive environment for everyone. And just a note that we're recording the session today and we'll share it afterwards. I'll pop the link to the Code of Conduct into the chat as well. And with that, I'm pleased to hand over to Mustafa. Mustafa, the floor is yours.
Claire, thank you so much for organizing this talk, and I'm really grateful to Ignite Network for supporting this project and the scoping survey because it's been a challenging process. We tried to gather responses, but for a couple of months, we only were able to secure 30 or so responses for our survey, and then we used Prolific to generate further responses from EDI professionals in energy sector in the UK. So I would like to thank the Ignite Network for being extremely supportive in this process. I wrote the survey report with Cihat Erbil from Ankara, and he's not here today, but I'm presenting the report also on his behalf. So in this report, what I'm going to explain is how UK energy sector is doing in terms of EDI interventions, evaluating their maturity, effectiveness, and future. And we are going to also explore some options for how the UK sector can take the EDI efforts further. Of course, that will happen if I manage to move my slides. Yes. The central finding of our scoping survey is that the sector is very high on formalization. So there is no shortage of commitment to EDI in the sector. Most organizations are committed in terms of leadership discourses and policy statements. They're also appearing to be compliant in writing. Yet this formalization has not turned often into operational follow-through. And this is not surprising. If you look at other sectors, other scholars have also identified that hyper-formalization of EDI has not always generated EDI practices that are effective at the ground level. For example, we found that only 17% of the organizations use the data to inform their decisions in terms of practice and activities. So there is also a gap in terms of collecting data and formalization of data to making use of the data, EDI data. So the verdict in our findings is that there is need for transformation of the sector to benefit from the positive outcomes of EDI, because EDI would generate positive outcomes only if you manage it well strategically and also if you invest in it. And alongside the survey, because this survey contained open-ended questions, I presented some of the quotes, striking quotes from the survey. So one participant was saying leadership rhetoric is strong, but translation into action, ownership and behavioral change is uneven and incomplete in the sector. And if you look at the strategic intent and leadership discourses, we see that there is extensive executive endorsement in the sector. 65% of the executives support EDI interventions, and 68% of organizations have formal strategies. Of course, you can see the impact of the current backlash on EDI in this sector as well, because in earlier reports or national reports I have done for UK in general, suggested over 85% support from leadership. So I think that the current low, it's still high level, but lower level of leadership commitment is due to the recent alt-right turn and backlash in the UK. But what remains problematic is not endorsement by leaders, because it is largely there, but operational reality. Only 23% of staff are fully satisfied with EDI interventions, and 38% believe endorsement translates into meaningful investment. So although organizations profess to be committed, they don't invest enough, according to participants. According to only 38% believe that investment is adequate. So our EDI strategy, one participant mentioned, is strategy looks good on paper, but there is no visibility of how it translates into real change. So there is a gap between what organizations promise and what they deliver in terms of EDI. In the EDI literature, you will often see that there are strategic, legal, and ethical rationales, motivations for organizations to support EDI. And the literature also shows that at the intersection of these three, organizational EDI efforts can be sustainable. If you rely too heavily on strategic intent for EDI, you miss out on the human rights dimensions and also ethical dimensions. If you lean too heavily on ethical dimensions, you miss out on strategic consequences, for example, attracting talent, innovation, workforce diversity, fostering productivity, or legal aspects. So most organizations need to consider the three aspects, not separately, but together, to create sustainable change. And we are seeing that most of the organizations are focusing on strategic intent and less on legal and even less on ethical aspects. But only at the intersection of these three, there is effective change. In this report, we call the situation as frozen middle, because at the top level commitment is there. Half of the executives are strongly committed and half are still committed or a limited commitment. But line managers, this commitment reduces to 35%. And we explored why in the qualitative responses, and one respondent said EDI isn't in their KPIs, when the key performance indicators of middle managers do not include EDI-related criteria, they treat EDI as optional. So the leadership commitment does not translate into action because EDI commitments are not translated into actionable performance criteria for staff. And oftentimes, EDI is siloed into HR. So it's HR's problem rather than everyone's responsibility. So this lack of shared responsibility or devolved responsibility and direct attribution of EDI to HR limits its possibilities of contribution to innovation, to sustainability, to resilience of the organization. And what we found really interesting in this scoping survey is that activity does not equal impact. There were certain activities which generated high impact according to the participants. For example, flexible working efforts had structural impact when work made flexible through flexible time arrangements or flexible place arrangements. More people could be accommodated with the EDI considerations. Inclusive recruitment also, with blind CVs, diverse panels, were considered as structurally high impact efforts. Funded employee networks. Many participants found these useful and deeply transformative. But there were also more common efforts across the sector that had limited impact or even negative impact, according to participants. For example, generic unconscious bias training. Although training is important and helpful, what we learn out of this training is not looped into organizational actions. So what individuals learned out of unconscious bias training did not translate into organizational learning. It's very important that organization learns out of the efforts of EDI interventions rather than individuals being forced to learn alone, because organizational change can generate greater outcomes. And one of celebration days, actually, these were received in a cynical way, and they were not so much appreciated. They were considered superficial and performative by participants. And unfunded and volunteer-led networks put extra pressure on already disadvantaged groups. And these were also not considered very well connected. They were symbolic efforts, lacked follow-up, and there was lack of metrics. One participant said, performative gestures without structural change are merely a smokescreen for inaction. True impact requires dismantling barriers, not just celebrating diversity. Generic training modules are fine. We don't want to knock them down because they are necessary, but they are the baseline. And they are insufficient for behavioral change. If you look at the current literature, particularly recent papers in the Nature magazine showing behavioral change and what is required for behavioral change is sustained through two forms of interventions. One is resources. You can allocate stronger resources to an area of intervention. For example, you improve investment into EDI, and that will lead to EDI-led changes in behaviors. Or you can change routines. Rules and resources are the two things that lead to behavioral change. So relying on training alone for behavioral change is ineffective. Training is important for raising awareness, but it doesn't lead to behavioral change on its own. This is because of the learning loop failure. Training is treated as compliance event rather than a learning process. So if you want the training to lead to behavioral change, you need to tie the training into changes in behavioral norms that will come with performance criteria, the rule book for how people should behave at work, and behavioral norms, setting behavioral norms with EDI principles in mind. And also several participants criticized the like sheep dipping exercise in training. It's the same training we've had for 5 years. It hasn't changed how decisions are made. So they see the disconnect between training and decision-making mechanisms and the functioning at work. So at the information systems level, we also identified a gap through this survey. 63% of the participating organizations track demographic data, and 17% use this data. So small number, 1 in 5, less than 1 in 5, use this data for decision making or changing decision making systems for fairness and inclusion. And only 12% link EDI outcomes to accountability. So if you look at the organizational learning loop, the point about collecting data is to change and transform organizations in light of the data we collect. We see vulnerabilities, we see exclusions, we see discrimination, and then we use the data to make evidence-based decisions to support inclusion, to support equality, to support diversity and fairness at work. So there is this feedback gap evident according to our survey. We also looked at multiple categories of diversity. There certain categories of diversity were visible. For example, gender and ethnicity were more visible. Actually, this religion should not be there. Religion is really high up. It's a mistake on the slide. Sorry about that. I tried to cover it, but I wasn't able to do that. Clearly didn't correct that mistake. So gender, ethnicity, and all the compliance-related criteria were there. Sexual orientation, disability, religion, and belief. Yet, there are other hidden categories of diversity and inclusion which were less pronounced. For example, socioeconomic background, class distinctions in the energy sector are very pronounced, but they were not monitored well. Similarly, neurodiversity is monitored by very few organizations. I think the difficulty is that many organizations focused on just compliance for complying with legal norms in monitoring diversity and inclusion data instead of using this data to identify vulnerability and exclusion and discrimination in real terms. Because legal forms only capture what is really evident and what meets the eye, not what is beneath the surface. Of course, if you look at the reasons why this bleak picture is happening, why leadership messages are not translating into middle-level management practices and worker satisfaction, we looked for external forces, external reasons, and internal barriers. Two external reasons were identified in the survey. One is Brexit. There was a talent pool shrinkage, which meant that organizations struggled with EDI-led recruitment efforts. And the energy crisis also put itself as a priority in the sector, which relegated EDI efforts into secondary considerations or optional considerations. But internally, there were really significant barriers also. There was lack of leadership buy-in. 58% leadership buy-in is really low, and we attribute this to multiple factors: an alt-right turn, an anti-EDI turn, anti-woke turn, not only in the UK, but in other countries as well, particularly in North America. So there were also insufficient resources. A lot of organizations suffered from withdrawal of EDI funding, and there was also fatigue and overload. Participants complained about being surveyed too much, and when these surveys did not turn into a greater fairness in their workplaces. So we came up with two future crafting ideas. How do we move from this scenario to another one? We need to move from intent. Intent is very clear. Sector is still committed to EDI, but these commitments are not integrated fully into action. So what can we offer as like a Monday morning checklist for leaders, Monday afternoon, but let's imagine it's the morning. KPIs. We need to embed EDI metrics into departmental leadership performance evaluations. Leaders need to be held accountable somehow for not only stating their commitment, but also delivering on those commitments. We also need to secure multi-year ring-fence funding to protect initiatives from budget cuts. Also use data dashboards to track progress and signal executive accountability. So we need to close somehow this learning loop within organizations and shift the responsibility for delivering EDI from HR and individual workers back to the organizations and back to the executive leaders. So the best practice would be the anchor approach, some of the participants suggested, tying inclusion to long-term organizational resilience and innovation. So how will it look? The second future crafting scenario. At the moment, we are like the model on the left, siloed model. HR is at the center, and all departments are looking to HR for EDI ideas, and is considered HR's responsibility and work. So when someone in marketing hears of HR, they don't, hears of EDI, they would direct people to HR rather than dealing with EDI concerns within marketing themselves. The distributed model, however, requires that we need to move responsibility and accountability across all aspects of the organization. So HR can still play a service role. It can still help business units to understand their particular roles, but business units need to take on full accountability and responsibility for EDI actions. They cannot simply delegate it to HR. So what would be the 2030 roadmap? When we look at the organizations that we surveyed, some were just starting their EDI efforts. Some had years of experience in EDI. So it's very important to understand for organizations, it's very important for organizations to understand where they are at in their EDI efforts. So we can treat this like a maturity map or pathway. At the immediate phase, many organizations are doing things like auditing data usage, closing feedback loops, stop performative unfunded events. They need to start questioning what's going wrong with their EDI efforts and what is working in terms of their EDI interventions. What kind of interventions are yielding better results and what are failing? And in the medium term, we need to carry these organizations to structural embedding, revising KPIs to include EDI metrics for middle management. So tasking middle management to translate leadership messages. Securing multi-year funding. It's very important. Behavioral change does not come without investment or changes in habits and rules. So expand focus on neurodiversity and class. So we need to expand focus of EDI interventions beyond what is legally protected. Class and neurodiversity are two examples which are significant in the sector, but yet under explored and under monitored. And finally, long-term cultural integration can be achieved, but organizations need to set this as a maybe 2030 roadmap, full intersectional approach. At the moment, each category of diversity is treated on their own. Gender is treated separately to ethnicity. As a result, for example, minority ethnic women's concerns get sidelined because they are not prioritized neither in gender nor in ethnicity categories. So we need to find safety nets and create vulnerability maps through intersectional approach so that our siloed and single category approach to EDI does not lead to further inequalities and does not entrench inequalities further. So we need to also move towards a distributed leadership model, as I explained, and EDI should act as a driver for innovation, not just a compliance issue. So this is the infographics for this presentation. Presentation will be available. If you want, I can. I have already shared it with Claire, or you can write to me directly to receive the presentation. So, my final words: inclusion should not be a checklist. At the moment, we are seeing that many organizations are treating it as box exercise because of the backlash and also reduced commitment at the middle level management. It should serve as a sector compass because EDI is essential for the long-term sustainability and resilience of the energy sector. It's not just an optional extra. So on this note, I end my presentation. Any questions and feedback would be most welcome.
Thank you, Mustafa, for that insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Does anybody have any questions for Mustafa? You put your hand up and have any at the moment? I have a question to get us started. So from your perspective, Mustafa, which of the findings of the survey surprised you the most and why?
Actually, as a researcher who's been doing EDI work for 30 years, what I really found uncomfortable was the decline in leadership commitment. Because I did a survey, national survey in 2000, 20 years ago, for Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, looking at diversity responses of EDI leaders and actually leaders in three sectors, public, private, and voluntary sectors in the UK, similar scoping survey, and the commitment was over 85%. And in 2010, we have seen this commitment rise in OECD survey I helped conduct based in France in 10 different countries, huge commitment at the executive level suit. And now we come to 2025, commitment is really like maybe 20% less in this survey. This was the most disturbing aspect, but still it is there. And enlightened executives are committing to continuing to commit to EDI, but there is a significant backlash. Thank you so much, Claire. And Becky has a
Yeah,
hand up.
see that.
Yeah. Hi, Mustafa. So that's really interesting. I I wonder whether I had a couple of things, but I wonder whether that is in. So your point about the interest dropping, clearly, global politics has had a influence on that. But I also wonder whether, in part, your findings have an influence on it in the sense that they have contributed what they see as a lot of resource and time and positions to this, and it hasn't had the impact it should have had in the company. So they probably see themselves as putting a lot into it and not seeing that deliver. And executives at a high level are used to expect to see delivery. And I know that is because of the way they are implementing and where, but I wonder if that is part of the issue, and if so, whether we can give them some, try and give people some levers to turn that round.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, in since 2000, there were some significant pieces of work coming from North America and also some European scholars showing that certain diversity interventions do not generate positive outcomes. We know, for example, unconscious bias training can even lead to negative outcomes as it raises awareness, but organizational commitment does not change. So people become further dissatisfied with what they are seeing at work. So you are so right, Becky, in pointing out that this may be executive level recognition that what they have invested in has not been
Worked.
in the
Yeah.
right direction. Absolutely. So you're very right in that. Because also the research showed that there is a feedback loop. If your EDI intervention has positive impact, it gets further funded. So, clawing of funding cannot be attributed only to backlash, but also to very legitimate reasons. There was a lot of neoliberal framing of EDI, very performative. Oh, here is a training we have done. There was no monitoring of outcomes. Year after year, the same training is done. And actually, when I survey staff, this is one of my key findings that the most traumatic training they receive is generally an EDI training.
So it's funny. So I was talking to well, to a director of a construction company, basically, and it's the only one I've ever come across where they have done their sort of annual promotion round. And the way those work, usually in construction anyway, or in the civil engineering sector, is that middle managers, which you were pointing out, make recommendations for pay rises, etc. And he took those recommendations, and this was just around gender, but he took those recommendations, calculated what next year's gender pay gap was going to be, sent it back to the middle management and said, think again. And I have never come across anybody else who has taken that attitude. And as it happens, it was going to make the gender pay gap slightly worse. And he went, absolutely not, think again. But I think that, and then they came back with new recommendations. But I think that is a really unusual thing to do, quite honestly.
Yes, this is amazing actually, because I was invited to examine an organization's pay efforts and bonus efforts in light of EDI. And what they were arguing was that as 100% of the bonuses this year went to men, there was no gender pay gap.
Yes.
So I said this shows actually 100% gender pay gap
Yeah.
in
So
bonus.
that, I mean, that to me is effectively is a sort of what he was saying to me is like, but it's not quite how you had it, but it's essentially giving middle management KPIs, saying you must improve in the recommendations you make, they must improve the gender pay gap, is a and then some targets perhaps. And I
Yeah.
guess you can only do that if your managers are in charge of a sufficient number of people to make that work, because you need a certain flexibility in the base so that you are getting good people coming up as well. And it's not a forced move, but
Yes.
so it needs to be doable. It needs to be a target people can actually hit. But yeah, I think that's sort of very similar to having a middle management KPI.
And also, the example you give is very foresightful, insightful as well, because Iceland has declared gender pay gap unlawful. It's the first country which uh, did that. And other countries will follow through because performance has improved. There are many positive outcomes of um, declaring gender pay gap unlawful. At the moment, we are only doing voluntary monitoring. Organizations know that there is wide gender pay gap, but I think if we take this next step, progressive step, I think the company you suggested will be ahead of the game, which is fantastic. Delegating responsibility from executive to mid-level management to check again with EDI lights how they can improve, how they can close the gender pay gap and other pay gaps as well. Because we're
Yeah,
now monitoring, but we don't do much in terms of changing this. It's really progressive. I think we need to write something, maybe a case study on this company. I would be happy to do that if they would like to, share the practice, because I haven't heard this before.
no, I haven't either. So, anyway, I'm hogging the floor. Has anybody else have a question?
Hi, Konstantinos. Long time no see.
Hello, yeah, indeed. Uh, and I was thinking, I mean, to be honest, I've missed your presentation because of my messiness with links for the Zoom call. But anyway, so maybe you covered this, so I'm going to ask anyway. And if you covered it, maybe I'll ask a different time. So that is, so previously when I was involved in a bit of a company work that was in offshore wind industry, and they did have a major issue, as you can imagine, with making their workplace. I mean, particularly the actual offshore wind engineering part of the work, making it a bit kind of more, let's say, suitable for women at work. And they were very open with making adaptations and making the workplace a better suited place for women. And I, I have to say, I was quite impressed by how much they wanted to do. They wanted advice. They wanted um, detailed information. They were very keen to make it work. Um, and so at times, I, I think that was partly because they were regulated to increase number of women in their teams in their workforce. And I'm wondering if really the answer sometimes is, do we just need better regulation in some areas that will just force some of these changes and motivate industry to go in there and make it happen? I,
Yes,
I mean,
I
I don't know
agree.
if that's the
I
only
think
answer, but
regulation is absolutely essential. Um, and also, what works is having a progressive stance. Start listening to people who are excluded and understanding their terms for inclusion.
yeah.
Because if the workplace is not safe for a certain group, their absence is not surprising. So I think creating safe space can come through either coercive regulation or voluntary measures. I still believe that voluntary measures could work if the leaders are enlightened.
Mm, okay, okay. Mm.
Any other questions? I see Becky talking, but you're on mute.
Sorry, I was going to say that I think the regulation works in a similar way in many ways to the middle management KPIs. It's about setting targets that people need to meet um, at a so it's a sort of similar type of, and I mean, I think the advantage of having KPI, if as long as management buy into it, the advantage of having KPIs is they move, or they can move much faster than regulation, which tends to take forever. So you create a baseline, but then you never get the next. It takes a very long time to get the next jump. That's the only thing I would say. But um, I'd be interested to know in your survey, I don't know if you looked at this, Mustafa, but whether when you talk about so you had flexible working, which is a little bit similar to the offshore scenario of trying to accommodate needs of the workforce. The Do you see any difference in the positive way in that is viewed between the different demographics, or does it essentially benefit everybody?
Which one? Flexible working.
Yeah, which is a bit like the offshore trying to accommodate people in the way. So it's a sort of similar thing to trying to work out how to get women in the offshore industry to work, because you were trying to be flexible in what you allowed people to do to fit around their family needs. And I just want, well, largely anyway, I just wonder whether when you were looking at that, actually people tend to think about that as something for women or carers at least, but actually my suspicion is that everybody likes it. It also
Yes,
makes
I
it
think
better for
all
men.
groups really would benefit from it, definitely. For example, neurodivergent people would definitely
Yeah.
benefit, but it's not so well monitored. I think we need to look at voice mechanisms, whose voice is heard, whose demands are heard.
So you
By
couldn't see that in your survey data. You couldn't see whether there was any difference by demographic.
There was a difference by demographic because you could see that the legal compliance categories had more investment, and they were listening to participants more if it was gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, religion, and belief. All those categories covered in the UK were protected by law, and there were mechanisms, established mechanisms, and networks. But for others, less. And there was also, unfortunately, a pecking order, Becky. So you could see gender and ethnicity as dominant categories, and there was less investment in other categories.
I think that is in part my guess. So looking at my own organisation, I suspect that might in part be to do with the fact that the data is people generally give that information.
Mhm.
Some of the other categories they don't give. So, and it's hard
Yes.
to spot.
That's very true because with sexual orientation data, it's sometimes 1%
Yeah.
response rate. It's really problematic, and similar with religion and belief, it's increasingly irrelevant in Britain. We know the proportion of people who don't consider religion as significant as increased. So those their interests have there's a social change. That's why I think monitoring needs to capture that. People don't know where to place themselves in a survey. I always find it very difficult.
You have another question.
Yes, Sana.
Yes, thank you for the beautiful presentation. My question is about the age gap. So, in the previous strategy document of the energy and utilities strategy in the UK, it said that there was this age gap because there is a lack of recruitment for young people. I was wondering if your research covered any like similar topics, because I used to think that that also had to do something with neurodiversity.
Yes, I think we can closely look at age issues. Age was covered as part of diversity categories, but it is not one of the categories that is funded. This is an interesting aspect because they didn't have, for example, age-related resource networks. Nobody mentioned that. It's a very interesting view, actually, because there's a lot of Gen Z trashing in the sector. If you look at sectors, materials, they are finding it difficult integrating young generation into
Yeah.
workplace. And I believe that recognition of neurodivergence and through diagnosis and self-awareness is wider in the new generation. Similarly, sexual orientation issues have become more pronounced with younger generation as compared to older generation. So I agree. I haven't considered the gender lens, but there is definitely a scope for exploring that within the data.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah. So Jackie.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Mustafa. I think the presentation was really, really interesting. So my organisation is based in Ireland, and we've been working on our EDI strategy now for the last 3 years. And what we find is the data gap that you talk about. We're challenged with the data protection legislation to actually go out and ask for some of that data. And plus, there's the piece around, the psychological safety, as you mentioned, around anybody disclosing any of the other things. So I think what we're trying to do is figure out a way of doing that and get people to self-declare, using a system that they do it maybe when they come in the door, and then we'd encourage them to do it in the future. But certainly to do a whole campaign on our organisation itself, because we're only 800 staff, it doesn't necessarily make sense for us to do that, because we can visibly see and we know our people reasonably well enough that we can determine where we think we know where the gaps are. But that doesn't mean it's that brilliant, it has to be said. In terms of the piece around gender pay gap and all the things that we do there's always this piece around where the technical staff have access to overtime pay, extra bonuses for doing out of hours work and all the rest. So that gap is always going to be there for us to a certain extent. Saying that, we have got ours down to 3.9%, but that's clearly not cool. It's still not okay. It shouldn't exist, but at least we're going in the right direction. And I think it's brilliant, the insight that you made around the executive level responsibility taking for, they're part of the organisation. That's what I've been trying to do, and I haven't got that buy-in yet. It's getting there, and what we're doing now this year, I actually deliberately asked this year to have it in the pillar directors performance management plan, that they have KPIs or targets or some kind of thing that they have to agree to in terms of GNI, and I couldn't get that buy-in. But I've got that we're sharing data with them, and we'll be feeding back to them to show them this is the status of your organisation. So it takes a long time to get buy-in, especially in our organisation. As I say, we've been doing this about 2018, 2019, and yeah, it's very slow work, especially in the energy industry.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for outlining how it is experienced in your organization. It's quite valuable. And using, I think, some composite surveys provides a better solution than delving into each category. For example, asking people how their inclusion could be improved, under what conditions, and what would their requirements be to make the organization more flexible. Then gathering those responses, starting a critical listening process, an active listening process from individuals to organizational design, participatory design, can help mobilize individuals to come out without stating their identities, protected identities, but expressing what would make their work more productive. So I think we need to sometimes make the surveys work for us in different ways. I realize that there is a lot of concern around disclosing, for example, ethnicity data, sensitive religion data, and those kinds of data, disability data, but people may be more forthcoming with what they need from the organization.
Actually sounds a really, really interesting approach. Something I'll take back. Thank you.
Just to add to that, I was just going to add to that very briefly. We found when we were doing STEM equals that individuals were much more likely to disclose if this type of work was not run by HR, by a really, really significant margin, to be honest. So if the data collection and everything else was not run through HR, so that it's completely separate to any data that might be used within the organization around performance or promotion, or because people are concerned that that information will be used.
This is a very good point, Becky. In support of this example, I have another example using AI, but bottom-up AI development, so that individuals can disclose, whistleblow, demand certain things from the organization, but the AI development is bottom-up, so it doesn't connect with the organization's information system. It doesn't disclose the individual's identity. It still provides confidentiality and anonymity. So these kinds of developments are happening in progressive organizations in other sectors. I'm aware of these bottom-up technology development companies, which generate more outcomes, EDI relevant disclosure, than absolutely dealing with it within HR, because they know HR can be handmaiden to management and can disclose your data. So the people have legitimate reasons why they don't trust HR.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions, or have we reached the end? I think we might have done. Yeah. So just to say thank you everyone for joining us today, and special thanks to Mustafa for sharing the insights of the report. It's really interesting. We'll be sharing the slides, hopefully. Is that okay, Mustafa, if I share the slides?
Yes, and also the report.
Yeah, and I'll share the report and the recording after the event. So keep an eye out in your inbox. And just to say thanks again, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was
Bye-bye.
great. Thanks, Mustafa.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.